Does good dialogue ever feel like a pipe dream? You might be willing to do your part to make it happen, but what about all the crazy people on the other side of the debate? It takes two people to make a dialogue, so if the other side is utterly uninterested in dialoguing well, it seems like it would be impossible to make good dialogues happen. I decided to test it. I took 200 college students from all kinds of political backgrounds, taught them how to dialogue well, and then set them loose to have dialogues with untrained friends and family members they disagree with. Here's what I learned. My name is Rebecca Carlson. I'm a fifth-year PhD student and teaching assistant in philosophy at the University of Southern California. Over the course of my time at USC, I've taught hundreds of students in discussion sections for classes on ethics, philosophy of law, philosophy of science, and philosophy of knowledge, aka epistemology, if you want to get fancy. Along with the main course material, I always teach my students some habits philosophers talk about that help them have good discussions with people they disagree with. Basically, dialogue tips. I teach them one dialogue tip a week throughout the semester, and then I give them a dialogue assignment at the end of the class. I ask them to have a conversation with a friend or family member that they disagree with about something important, so not whether the Seahawks are cooler than the Steelers, and then answer some reflection questions about the conversation. In the conversation, I ask them to do three things. First, come to a thorough, charitable understanding of what the person they're talking with thinks and why. Charity is one of the dialogue skills I teach them. If it's not a familiar term already, it involves two things. Work really hard to accurately understand what a person is saying, and if you have to choose between multiple possible interpretations of what they said, choose the one that makes their argument the strongest or the smartest. It's basically giving someone's arguments and intelligence the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume they meant something stupid unless you've ruled out everything else they could have meant. Second, I ask them to work together on the same team with the person to figure out the root of their disagreement. By root of the disagreement, I mean what premise they disagree about that's leading them to disagree about the conclusion. So, for instance, a pro-life person and a pro-choice person might discover that the root of their disagreement about whether abortion should be legal is that they disagree about whether fetuses are people, or about whether bodily autonomy justifies abortion, or both. And third, I ask them to not try to convince the person of anything. Obviously, trying to convince people of things is not inherently bad. It's a really important part of good dialogue. But we will be in a much better position to try to convince each other if we start by intentionally taking time to understand where each of us is coming from and what the root of our disagreement is. Starting a dialogue off that way sets it up for success both intellectually and relationally. Intellectually, it produces clarity for both of us about my view, about the other person's view, and about where we diverge, what points we would need to convince each other about to change each other's mind on the main issue. And relationally, it starts us off on the right foot by giving both of us a chance to demonstrate to each other that we genuinely care about understanding where the other person is coming from. It also puts us on the same team as we work to find clarity and figure out where the root of our disagreement is, which then makes it easier to kind of carry through that momentum and feel like we're still on the same team, pursuing truth together once we actually start trading arguments back and forth and trying to convince each other. And it is really easy to fall into skipping those clarification steps. So I tell my students that they are more than welcome, even encouraged, to follow up on the conversation they have for the assignment later on with conversations where they try to convince the other person. But I ask them to focus just on laying the groundwork in this first conversation. I created the assignment to teach my students about good dialogue. And it worked. When I asked them to reflect on the assignment in class, they often ended up passionately explaining the importance of the very things I had been teaching them about all semester, which warmed my teacher heart. But unsurprisingly, because this is how teaching goes, their experiences also taught me. Here are 3 lessons I've learned from my students' reflections on their dialogues. Some bad news, some good news, and some fantastic news. The bad news is that bad dialogue habits aren't limited to one side of any issue. It is not the case that pro-life people or pro-choice people or liberals or conservatives or religious people or atheists or any group you care to name are totally committed to good dialogue. And the only reason public discourse in this country is so bad is because those idiots on the other side refuse to follow suit. Neither my liberal students nor my conservative students came into my class knowing how to dialogue well. And most of the people my students dialogued with on every side of every issue made me cringe pretty hard with bad arguments and bad dialogue approaches. The problem is pervasive everywhere, not everywhere except on your team. The good news is that good dialogue habits aren't limited to one side of the issues either. This may surprise conservatives, but my liberal students were just as eager as my conservative students to learn how to cultivate genuine, mutually respectful, truth-oriented dialogues with people they disagree with, even on the issues they care about most. And this may surprise liberals, but my conservative students were just as eager as my liberal students to learn how to cultivate genuine, mutually respectful, truth-oriented dialogues with people they disagree with, even on the issues they care about most. If we only listened to people on our own side talking about the craziest things people on the other side say, instead of actually listening to real people in our lives who are on the other side, it's very easy to end up thinking that the other side is staunchly committed to avoiding good dialogue, or even just utterly incapable of good dialogue. But empirically, my experience is that that's just not the case. And finally, the best news is that dialogue habits are contagious. Several of my students chose to do their dialogue assignment with someone they'd had bad dialogues or even shouting matches with in the past. And they said they were surprised at how smoothly this conversation went and how they were able to find genuine common ground, understand more about the issue, and have a really interesting conversation. One student said, quote, "I was pleasantly surprised that my mom and I kept ourselves calm and collected. In the past, we would definitely blow up over issues. This time was way different and way more enjoyable." So these conversations had gone badly before, and now they went well. But the thing that happened in between wasn't that both people were taught good dialogue habits. I only had my students in class, not their parents, partners, or friends. There were bad dialogues, and then one of the people in the dialogue learned good dialogue habits, and then there were good dialogues. You can't fix a dialogue single-handedly. It takes two good faith interlocutors to make a good faith dialogue, and you can't magically mind control the other person into engaging in good faith. But what you can do is make the first move. You can clearly communicate and demonstrate your care for the other person, your genuine desire to understand where they're coming from, and your openness to considering their point of view, even while they're not doing the same for you. It takes a little bit of work and a lot of charity, but my students' experience indicates that if you do that, far more often than not, the other person will meet you halfway, even people you think of as crazy extremists. This is awesome news, but it's also news that puts us on the hook. In some ways, it would be easier if we could just wash our hands of the state of public discourse, resort to dropping truth bombs, and say the other side is utterly incapable of good dialogue, so why even try? But they're not. Dropping truth bombs is way less work, and in the short term, way more emotionally satisfying than cultivating good dialogue. So there's a sense in which it would be nice if it were the only option. But it's not. There is a path to mutual, respectful, truth-oriented dialogue available to us. And like it or not, I think that means we have a responsibility to take it.